In Washington, D.C. in 1967, Calvin Reddick is advised to be cautious because they aim to make an example out of him. He then prepares to testify before a committee. The story begins in Atlanta in 1941. Young Calvin works as a shoeshiner outside a bank, hearing all the conversations of customers about finances and real estate investment. After his customers leave, he writes everything down in his notebook. One day, he stands by the window to gather more information from a bank meeting, but a cop sees him and pulls him down. A chase follows and Calvin manages to escape, but the cop vows to tell his father. That night, Calvin's dad scolds him for spying on white people, explaining how black men have been hanged for less. He notices the notebook and admits that Calvin is very smart, but cautions him that white men will never let him succeed financially. Despite this, Calvin, determined, swears he will be rich one day. In Chicago in 1956, an older Calvin is married to Naomi, and they have a son. They are visiting Naomi's family, and her uncle shares that an automobile company, Skyline Motors, is hiring black men. Calvin declines the offer, stating he is trying to make money through real estate. His goal is to own property and earn money through rent. The family is currently renting a small shed from Naomi's uncle, who becomes angry and accuses Calvin of not wanting to work. After dinner, Naomi tells her uncle that Calvin is a genius and that their situation will improve soon. She then joins her husband in the shed, and Calvin promises to get them out of there as quickly as possible. The next day, Calvin takes Naomi's cousin Deshawn to work. Deshawn's friend Tark admires Calvin's car and assumes he is wealthy, prompting Deshawn to reveal that Calvin owns buildings. Later, Calvin visits various buildings in a white neighborhood, checking their condition and prices. Soon, he tells Naomi that he has found the ideal building, but purchasing it would leave them without money for renovations. Believing they need a co-investor, Naomi proposes introducing Calvin to Eli, her former employer before marriage. Eli is laid back and jokes around, which makes Calvin unable to take him seriously, and he refuses to work with him. Couple leaves without disclosing their business idea, and as they exit, they encounter the governor visiting Eli, who is his friend. This still does not sway Calvin's decision. Later, Calvin meets with Gerald, the owner of the house he wishes to buy. Calvin asks Gerald if he could loan him $10,000 for renovations upon purchasing the house, but Gerald declines, citing some incorrect calculations. Calvin quickly points out the mistakes, impressing Gerald, but he still won't provide the loan. Before leaving, Calvin notices a calendar sent by Douglas of Midwest Trust Bank. He visits the bank asking for Douglas. The secretary informs him that Douglas is unavailable, although Calvin sees him, indicating that he is being shunned due to his race. Instead, Calvin decides to wait outside the bank. Eventually, when Douglas leaves work, Calvin approaches him to discuss a business idea that could benefit both him and Gerald. That night, Calvin tells Naomi that he did not receive the loan. At that moment, he gets a call from Gerald, who has learned that Calvin used his name to talk to Douglas. Gerald questions whether Calvin believes his actions align with normal business practices, to which Calvin replies no. This makes Gerald pleased because he appreciates those who defy normal customs, announcing that Calvin can visit the bank in the morning to secure the loan, and that he will be his guarantor. Following this, Naomi and Calvin go out to celebrate. Eli approaches Calvin and continues to tease him, leading Calvin to dislike him even more. The next day, Calvin and Deshawn start working on renovating the property. A tenant spots them and scolds them for being in a white neighborhood. Calvin asserts that he is the new owner, but the elderly woman does not believe him. Moments later, Tarek arrives to assist, and Calvin inquires if Tarek would be fine with working for a black man. Tarek responds that the only color he cares about is money green. The three of them work hard on the renovations throughout the day. Shortly after, 2 police officers arrive, responding to the elderly woman's complaint about the black men working in the building. Calvin shows them the paperwork proving he is the building owner, and the officers quickly depart. Once the renovations are complete, Calvin moves into one of the apartments, and the elderly woman, spotting him, decides to move out the next morning to avoid living next to a black family. Soon after, more black individuals inquire about renting the apartments, and the property becomes fully leased within a few days. Gerald is impressed and proposes that Calvin become his business partner. Calvin can choose the buildings because he has a good eye, while Gerald will be the face of the business to sidestep bigotry. The two shake hands and agree to a 50-50 partnership. For the next few weeks, the new business duo continues acquiring properties, with Tarek and Deshaun aiding in renovations and Naomi selecting decor. One day, Calvin asks Naomi for ideas for a large house, only to reveal that this is their new home. Sometime later, Gerald is discovered dead in his bed. After the funeral, Gerald's wife expresses her desire to dissolve the business and offers Calvin 25% of the profits. Calvin confronts her, stating he is entitled to 50%, but since his name isn't on any documents, he has no choice but to accept the offer or receive nothing at all. The lawyer informs Calvin that to validate the original agreement, he will require a witness. Calvin attempts to meet Douglas at the bank, but Douglas refuses to see him. On his way out, Calvin notices a sign that reveals how much space the bank occupies. He visits Eli to present his idea. They should collaborate to buy the banker's building. This way, none of the bank's renting space there could refuse to give them loans, which would lead to more property acquisitions. Eli appreciates the concept but raises concerns that no one would want to sell to black men, prompting them to enlist Tarek to serve as the business's face. Tarek is hesitant, feeling unqualified regarding the venture, and ultimately decides to leave despite the men's assurances of support. Later, Tarek visits a diner, still anxious about the entire plan. Waitress Emily inquires if he is all right, and he shares that he is considering a new career in real estate. Emily is impressed, which boosts Tarek's confidence, prompting him to rush back to the others to accept the job. The initial training for Tarek involves teaching him how to communicate with wealthy individuals, so Eli organizes early morning golf outings to teach the game. They are soon joined by Eli's banker, Martin, who is willing to lend $2 million. Calvin assures Martin they will acquire the building for less. Next, Calvin instructs Eli on the necessary calculations for the job, although Tarek struggles with math. Over the following weeks, Tarek diligently practices both golf and mathematics. While he faces challenges initially, he gradually gains confidence, impressing the others by making a hole-in-one and completing a mathematical calculation successfully. Now ready for his first suit, Eli shows him how to drink like a gentleman, and Naomi educates him on dining etiquette. When Tarek successfully performs a mental calculation while golfing, the men conclude he is prepared for the next step. The banker's building is owned by Clifford, who frequently plays golf at an exclusive country club. Eli arranges for Tarek to attend as a guest, pretending to be his chauffeur to enhance his image. Utilizing his golf skills, Tarek impresses everyone and successfully arranges a meeting with Clifford in his office. For a week, Eli and Calvin train him, ensuring that when the day arrives, Tarek is ready to address all of Clifford's inquiries. He memorizes all calculations and presents them as if he is calculating on the spot. In the end, Clifford agrees to sell the building for $1,560,000. After celebrating, they begin redecorating the office, establishing a rapidly growing relationship with the bankers. Soon they secure necessary loans and purchase numerous properties in affluent white neighborhoods. This newfound financial stability enables Tarek to marry Emily. In a few months, the trio becomes the largest real estate firm in the state, even meeting the vice president. A few years later, in 1963, Calvin returns to Atlanta with his family to visit his father. The elderly man is delighted to see him and proudly recounts his achievements. The next day, while walking with his son, he explains why the fountains are segregated. Calvin pauses at the spot where he used to work and requests the new shoe shiner to polish his shoes. But the man refuses because of Calvin's race. Staring at the bank where he learned everything, Calvin has a revelation. Upon returning to Chicago, he tells Eli he wants to purchase the bank in Atlanta. Eli highlights their lack of knowledge about running a bank, which is complicated, and worries that Georgians would not accept a black man in charge. Calvin suggests they can utilize Tarek once more and argues that a significant untapped market exists because black individuals are denied loans. After a lengthy debate, a reluctant Eli ultimately concedes, not wishing to lose Calvin as a partner, even if he considers it a bad idea. Later, Martin assists Tarek in purchasing the Atlanta bank for Calvin and Eli. As part of the arrangement, the previous owner and his son Bryce Whitcomb retain a 20% stake. Subsequently, Calvin starts reaching out to the black community in Atlanta, informing them that the bank has changed its policies and now welcomes black clientele. He also advises discretion, as racist individuals would oppose such changes. All loans are processed through Calvin and Tarek, and soon many black-owned businesses in the area begin to thrive. After 3 months, Bryce, who still works at the bank, notices the number of loans Tarek has been approving and wonders about the sudden influx of new clients. Tarek evades the question, and Bryce grows suspicious, beginning to follow him. He witnesses Tarek conversing with Calvin and documents it with photographs. That evening, as Tarek returns home, Emily confesses her dislike of Georgia. She points out Tarek is only receiving a salary when he was promised a partnership. The following day, Bryce arrives at Calvin's residence during a meeting with Tarek and Eli. He states he has no problem working for black individuals, but is concerned that if the local populace finds out, their business will fail. He reveals the source of his worries: a letter from the U.S. Treasury Department stating they will conduct an inspection in a month due to anonymous complaints about the bank making too many risky loans. After Bryce departs, Tarek suggests they examine a smaller bank for an idea. They could acquire this small bank and he can manage it himself, employing financial strategies to distribute the loans between both institutions, thereby lessening suspicion during the inspection. Eli and Calvin express concerns about their lack of experience in such a risky venture, leading Tarek to declare he will cease to help them if he does not receive equal partnership rights as well. With limited options, the pair reluctantly agrees. Soon after, Tarek purchases the small bank, and on the first day of operation, Naomi poses as a cleaning lady to monitor situations. Meanwhile, Deshawn accompanies Calvin around town to strategize loan allocations. That night, they convene at a restaurant with Tarek to finalize plans, but are dismayed to see racist graffiti on the sign. The next day, Tarek meets with a lawyer to finalize paperwork. Later, Bryce contacts Tarek to inform him that some white customers wish to withdraw all their money, suspecting the bank is affiliated with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That night, Calvin shows Eli a racist sign he found at the bank. He explains that 5 white customers withdrew their funds while Bryce convinced 9 to stay. Eli suspects it was Bryce who instigated the rumors. A few days later, a federal bank examiner arrives at the small bank to review the accounts, prompting Tarek to call Calvin for assistance. However, Calvin is uncertain of what to do, knowing that they would never allow a black man in the meeting. Naomi suggests he disguise himself as a servant, and when he hesitates, she reminds him that she has done similar things multiple times. Calvin argues that it is different for her because she is a woman, inciting a furious Naomi to compare his flawed logic to the excuses white individuals make about blacks. Recognizing his error, Calvin agrees to don a uniform and impersonate a janitor at the bank. He cleans near the door to Tarek's office to provide hints, but unfortunately, the examiner closes the door to block anyone from overhearing private discussions. Calvin has no choice but to walk away, leaving Tarek anxious as the examiner uncovers numerous discrepancies in his accounts. Pretending to need a file, Tarek rushes to the restroom to consult with his friends, who offer as much advice as possible. However, when Tarek returns to his office, the examiner has already detected significant errors in the accounts that he cannot justify. In a panic, Tarek heads back to the restroom with the files, and Calvin quickly identifies the mistakes as well. Eli wonders how Martin could have overlooked those, and Tarek is compelled to admit he used a different man to expedite the process. This new attorney was referred by Bryce, and both Eli and Calvin angrily realize that Bryce had been scheming to ruin them from the start. That night, Calvin shares the outcome of the meeting with Naomi. They must sell 27 faulty loans and cover all the losses personally, amounting to $300,000. Later, Calvin and Eli tell Tarek that they will not assist him. People like them could face severe repercussions if caught, and it was Tarek's suggestion to buy the small bank placing the responsibility squarely on him. The following morning, Martin informs Eli that his bank acquired all the loans from Tarek's bank. Soon after, Eli and Calvin storm into Tarek's office to demand an explanation. Tarek insists this is a temporary arrangement, allowing him more time to rectify the accounts. However, the duo points out that this constitutes fraud. At that instant, agents from the Treasury Department arrive, declaring that the bank has lost its license. The agents dismiss Tarek and instruct all clients to vacate, asserting that the bank is closed until further notice. As soon as Eli and Calvin exit, FBI agents approach them to arrest them without providing any reasons. Calvin denounces their racism, attempting to resist arrest, but the agents easily overpower him. Later, in Washington, D.C., a lawyer informs Eli and Calvin that the state banking charges have been dropped, but federal charges remain. A senator from Arkansas is conducting hearings about lax oversight in banks, and the lawyer suspects he intends to leverage the case for political purposes, which may aid in dropping the federal charges as well. Meanwhile, Tarek remains embroiled in his own legal issues with his bank, and authorities present him with a deal. His charges will be dropped if he testifies against his former associates. A few days later, Tarek takes the stand in court, outlining all of Eli's and Calvin's plans, claiming he was merely their employee and that they manipulated him. Calvin is then faced with two choices. If he admits to using lax rules to enrich himself, which would furnish Congress with grounds to amend those rules, he could obtain immunity. If he speaks freely, his statements will be contrasted with white individuals. And if the court determines he is lying, he will be incarcerated. After the hearing, Calvin strolls with Naomi, expressing his concerns. Accepting immunity would prevent him from shedding light on the systemic issues plaguing black individuals in the banking industry. Naomi assures him of her support, regardless of the decision. Prior to entering the courtroom, Calvin meets with Eli, reminiscing about their years of collaboration. In his testimony, Calvin asserts that the nation's foundational documents proclaim that all men are created equal, yet the law does not reflect this principle. Disregarding all warnings about the loss of immunity, Calvin rises with a cleaning uniform in hand, explaining that if a man cannot secure a loan, he cannot establish a business or purchase a home, fundamentally contradicting the American dream. Ultimately, the government confiscates Eli's and Calvin's fortunes and sentences them to 3 years in federal prison. They also lose all properties, although Naomi retains one house as it is in her name. Bryce ultimately repurchases the bank for a minimal sum. When the duo is finally released from prison, Naomi is puzzled by their laughter. They reveal that Tarek warned them prior to testifying that he would face 50 years in prison if he did not betray them. The men agreed to let him proceed, and in return, Tarek purchased 2 homes for them in the Bahamas before the government could seize their assets. Thanks to Eli's and Calvin's testimonies, the Congress passes the Fair Housing Act in 1968, making it illegal to refuse to sell or rent property based on race, religion, or gender.